The wind worked its knives in the seams of the wall and flayed every exposed inch of skin until even breath felt like a thing that could splinter and fall. Jon stood watch on the bridge, a black shape on white stone, the world to north and south blurred in the tumbling snow. He had learned the language of this place, the dry hiss of powder sliding over frost, the distant groan of ice settling in its ancient bed, the timber thrum of the palisade when a gust came hard, and still the wall could startle him when it chuckled like an old man or sang like a string of a harp. Tonight it sang somewhere deep in its bones, a note so low the teeth felt it. A lantern moved below, bobbing between knees and elbows and the snort of a horse, and a new recruit came up with a stubborn, lurching gait more like a fisherman than a farm boy. He was short, wrapped in greens under his black cloak, hood shadowing his face. The lantern flame shot sparks in the wind and snapped out. The boy arrived with a bundle wrapped in oiled leather tight as a heart, cradled in both hands. "Message for you," he said in a voice that held reeds and water in it. "From who?" "From a man who remembers a promise." The bundle smelled of damp earth and the sour rot of marsh. Jon took it and felt something small and brittle shift inside. He thought of bones, but when he set it under the lantern's weak light in the bottom of the tower and untied the wrappings with his thumb going stiff from the cold, he found a string of pale petals, pressed flat, the ghost of blue on them like sky behind snow clouds. Winter roses from a place where winter did not grow them. Under the petals lay a letter sealed with wax the color of the weeping water at dusk, stamped with a frog speared through by a tiny reed. He broke the seal and tried not to think of his father's face when last he had seen him. The script inside came steady, with a labor that meant the hand had written few words in his life and weighed each one. "Ned is dead," it began. "Men say Joffrey cut his head with a sword that had never borne a king's justice. You are far. That is how Ned wanted you. He wanted you safe. He asked me once to carry a thing that burned his hands whenever he held it. I have carried it through years of quiet and through the shouts of men who do not remember the names of the trees that fed their fathers. Now I return it." A name followed that Jon had only heard in his father's quiet company, spoken as other men might speak of a godswood that had saved them from a storm. Howland Reed. "I was with him at the Tower of Joy. I did not die. The men of the South tell their songs and paint their nights in bright colors, but they do not sing of the reeds. There were 3 at the tower, Dawn's Knight and Went's Man and the White Bull. But only one of us remembers the smell of the room where your mother lay. The roses were blue. She called them stars. She made him promise. I heard it because he made me turn away the blood." Jon's fingers felt too big for themselves. The tower swam. He saw a room he had never stood in, too bright with southern light, curtains moving, stone warm to the touch. He could hear the weight of a woman's breath at the end of it and the catch when it broke. "You are not Eddard Stark's bastard," the letter said, and the words were a knife that slid out slow. "You were born to Lyanna of Winterfell. You were born of Rhaegar Targaryen, born of a marriage before the gods, and before the Seven too. For the Dragon Prince put aside his Dornish wife before a septon with 7 and 7 hidden in his book. There was a man named Maynard who wrote it down. Men in Old Town keep such records. I have a copy of the line, cut from where it slept. I send it with this, but copies die in fire the same as men." The oiled packet held another scrap. Jon unfolded it with careful, clumsy hands. Most of the words were a hand scratch in a column of names and dates. Ink faded to the color of tea left too long, but he recognized Rhaegar's name and 2 more in a line, annulment union, a place and a strange signature. He read the last of the letter with the wall stones cold against his back. "Ned wanted you hidden until you were needed. I write because a boy with a wooden crown has dipped his hands into blood and called it sweet wine. I know what men will do to Stark blood and dragon blood, even if it is only a whisper. I am no dragon's man. I keep to the mud and am glad for it. But I remember a promise, and there are wolves in rivers now and lions on the road. They will come for the girls or break them where they stand. If you use the name, do it for them, not for yourself. Your mother asked for that too. She asked for a promise that had a way for the girls to go home. Do not hang the crown on your head merely to look tall." The petals clung to his glove when he folded the letter. He felt absurdly that he could smell something like summer behind the peat and the iron smell of the wall. He put the rose ghosts and the paper back in the oilcloth and went to Maester Aemon with the wind pulling at the door as if it wanted to come inside and listen. Aemon wore 3 blankets even by the stove and held his hands out to the fire as if warming them from long ago. When Jon read the words, he did not mean to, but he could not keep them to himself. The old man's blind eyes moved a little as if following swallows in spring. "Rhaegar," Aemon said, on the 4th or 5th breath after Jon fell silent. He loved to read. He would recite things until the pages learned him, not the other way. He rarely smiled except when you spoke of the songs. He had a way of listening to the world that made it more than it was. His voice thinned with a thread of pain so light it hardly weighed anything. "I did not think to see him again here, and I do not. But I hear his name on your mouth now, and I think of the boy at Summerhall with ash in his hair, and of a harp. It says I'm—" Jon stopped, felt the word clogging his throat. "Son." He had said it without thinking 1,000 times in his life, the way he had said bastard, said snow, said not a Stark. "It says I'm of him. It says so." Aemon reached for the packet with hands that knew the shape of paper. His fingers rested on the pressed petals without crushing them. "And it names Maynard, who was always numerate and fussy and entirely certain the gods cared for columns of figures. I knew him. Is it true?" It sounded childish when Jon heard himself. "Truth does not bend because we are cold," Aemon said. "But men do. Maynard's ink is true. I cannot say the words in this letter are what they pretend, but the reedfolk do not swim into cities for sport." He turned his face toward Jon in a way that felt like looking. "What would you do with this?" Jon thought of the girls the letter had meant. Arya with her scabbed knees and her wolf-quick eyes. Sansa with gallant songs and hands too neat to hold a knife. The smell in the dark halls when he had run the way a boy runs when he knows that if he makes his feet move fast enough the truth behind him can't catch him. Father taken, father dead, a king's sword salty with a crowd spit. He thought of Joffrey sitting too straight and too pleased with himself and the sound the city had made when the sword fell, like the gates of something closing. "I took a vow," he said. "I swore in front of the heart tree." "The gods love vows," Aemon said. "But they love men more, or I should hope they do, for we make so many vows we cannot help but break them just by breathing. I had a crown offered to me once, and I threw it away for my vows. I did not save my house by it. This is not only a crown." Jon held the packet like a thing that would choose its own fall if he let it go. "They have Sansa. They had Arya. For all I know, she's—" He swallowed. "Robb will keep the war and the north, but he cannot get into that city with a wolf alone." Aemon let the hush draw around them and did not disturb it while the fire breathed and the wind kept up its thin singing in the bones of the ice. "A man is not one thing," Aemon said gently at length. "No matter what words the world hangs around his neck, you have been a son and a brother and a bastard and a steward and a swordsman. You have been a friend and an enemy, a boy and a man. If the world is full of dead names that must be fed, feed them. But do not starve the living for them. You want me to stay. I want you to see," Aemon said. "If you go south to shout your name at a boy king, you will have done something. Ask yourself whether it will be the thing you meant to do. Ask whether you are willing to be a traitor to your oath in order to be faithful to something you swore without words when you were born." Aemon's hand found his wrist like a bird perching. "And ask whether you are willing to be fire to call winter's eyes. I have watched many kings break themselves because they did not ask." Jon slept badly and dreamed worse. He saw frost smoking off a stream that had not known ice in 100 years. He saw a rose pressed flat and the blue of it was a sky you could fall through, and he saw the tower, only a shadow of pale stone without doors, framed in a cliff of red, and a woman's hand slid off a bed sheet in a motion so familiar it felt like remembering the way back to the kitchen in a childhood house. He woke to the bell for the dawn watch and the sound of Sam snoring and turned his face into the thin pillow and said his father's name in a whisper too small even for the dawn to hear. He did not tell Gior Mormont. He did not tell Gren or PYP or Dolorous Ed, though Ed might have smiled at the idea that the world could take one more joke on itself and not crack. He kept the letter under the lining of his boot and the record page sewn into the black of his sleeve. He pulled his laces tight and felt the press of the packet against his skin like a bruise. He went to the yard and did his chores and counted barrels and kept the stores and answered Mormont's gruff thing like a blessing with the same yes, my lord, he had given yesterday. He told himself he could do this forever, that vows were a place you could stand in like a room, and though the walls might be cold, they would not move. Then a raven came. It wore Lannister seal wax and a gold thread on its tiny leg, because men found a way to teach even birds to carry their vanity, and the message that sat in Maester Aemon's old hands said, in a script too elegant to be real, that Queen Cersei Lannister, regent to his grace, King Joffrey of houses Baratheon and Lannister, named Sansa Stark traitor, her marriage betrothal to Joffrey dissolved for unseemly conduct in secret correspondence with traitors, and that she would be held as surety to the realm's peace. The letter smiled as it told them that such sureties were sometimes broken like plates. Aemon folded it once and then again, and the old man's mouth made a shape that was not a letter from any alphabet. Jon did not breathe while he read, and when he had finished not breathing, he found his chest hurt. That night, he went to the high walkway and stood where the wind was a blade and watched the ghost of the world below. The King's Road was a scar under the snow, and he could follow it with his eyes until it went away under mountain and cloud and the turn of the world. The packet in his boot felt like a living thing, warm as a pup, and he knelt, put his hand to his laces, and took it out. He went to Aemon again. He was not sure whether he had gone to ask permission or forgiveness. To save the realm, sometimes you must be prince and sometimes you must be crow, Aemon said, hands flat on his blankets. It is not clear which this is. I am too old to climb down after you and bring you back to your vows. Better men will try. If you go clean. Do not dress your choice in fine words. If you betray, then betray for love and for need, and take the punishment when it finds you. And remember, the cold does not stop at the top of the wall. Mormont's raven watched Jon when he packed. It said corn twice and then Jon, as if it were a prayer. He dressed in black and pulled another cloak over it, a traveler's weathered thing he had bought with barter from a peddler who had come crashing up from Queen's Crown without half his teeth. He tied a knife under his arm and strapped a sword to his hip and took the more ordinary of his 2 gloves, leaving the thick-furred pair for the man who would fill his place when he was gone. Ghost came at his heel without a word. He descended the stairs by the east side in a slow count, 170, 230, 500 and a few, listening for the clack of an alarmed boot behind him and hearing only the creak of old ice and the far peal of the bell. At the base, the wind had half filled the yard with a spin of sifted snow. He crossed it and did not look left at the door. He should have been opening for the knight's orders. The gate took his name when he spoke it and opened with a reluctant groan, as if it had to loosen itself out of years to make a gap for him. He went through into the wood so silent it made a sound in his ears, and when the gate closed behind him, he felt something in his chest do the same. Ghost pressed his muzzle into Jon's palm and then went ahead, white on white, vanishing and appearing as the trees saw fit. He followed the King's Road south. The road was a scar. Lannister host had whipped up it like a brush fire and left the blackened crowns of burned farms and the char of winter wheat and the bones of a dozen dogs that would no longer bark forever at a gate that had fallen on them. There were shoes in the ditches and a child's wool hat with grass frozen through it, and one woman's hair ribbon tied to a sapling branch as if she had meant to mark the place she would come back to and then had not. Jon did not move with the training of a ranger because he was not hunting, or not only that. He moved like a man whose name had shifted in his mouth and who did not know yet how to say it in his head. At a crossroads 2 days south, he found a chaos of men and horses and dogs tangled in a hedge and a cart riddled through with arrows, the shafts feathered crudely with crow wing and river gull both. Thuras of Myr had his bald head wrapped in a wine-stained scarf, and his beard was matted with a night's frost. But his eyes were bright in the way of men who spend themselves like coin and are surprised they still have any. "Who do we have here?" Thuras said, when Jon was pushed into the ring of horse legs and sagging leather. "Another boy who wants to be king, or a king who remembers he is a boy?" "Neither," Jon said. He did not draw steel. There were 3 bowstrings drawn in his peripheral, and the rhythm of the breathing of the men behind him was not calm. Ghost showed his teeth because Ghost did not have to be courteous. Beric Dondarrion sat a horse the color of smoke and held himself as straight as a lance despite the sunken place under his left eye and the scars that had mistaken his face for a map. The many times he had died were a tiredness on him, as if sleep stood just behind him at all times and tapped his shoulder. "What do you seek on a road the Lannisters have gnawed?" Beric asked. "A spider," Jon said. He surprised himself. He had not known until he said it. "And a city where they keep a girl I called my sister." "Ah," Thuras said, as if the answer pleased him. "Webs, then. We have cut a few. We can take you to a man who knows how not to stick when the thread comes thick." "Why?" Jon said. Thuras blew into his hands and smiled with crooked charm that was half boast, half priestly shameless. "Because the Lord of Light likes a good jest, and because I saw something last night in the coals when the wind poked at them." His eyes slid sideways. "A wolf with a dragon for its shadow. Teeth like the color of old bones. A boy with snow on his lashes and a girl with the frost in her hair that wasn't hair. They are only pictures," Beric said softly, as if gently rebuking a child. "And the gods have played worse tricks. Will you come?" Jon came because there was nothing else to do. They moved by night and camped under hedges and in ruined barns where straw still held the shape of a cow's flank from the last warm animal that had lain there. They reached a village whose name no one bothered to remember and went down cellar steps into a room that had once kept apples but now kept men and 2 ropes of dried onions and a fugitive smell of lamp fat. Inside, a thin man with precise hands and a face that did not want to give away any feelings other than polite curiosity watched him approach. The man wore brown plain enough to vanish and an expression that would be a smile only if you were the sort who petted cats backwards to see if they'd put up with it. "Ruggin," Thuras said in a drawl that meant he knew that was not the name. "We brought you a crow with airs. He wants to skitter through a web and not be eaten." "Many men want that," the thin man said, and if it was Varys behind the droop to his mouth and the servant stoop, Jon was not going to be the boy who shouted it. The eyes were wrong and right both in a way that made Jon think of the way the wind looked when it shaped snow into feathers. "Few bring something for the spinner, or else they bring too much." Jon slid the packet out of his sleeve. He did not say what it was. He set it on the table. The man who might be Varys did not reach for it. "What is your name?" he asked. "Jon Snow." "Snow." There was a tiny movement in his hands that said he liked beautiful things and one had just crossed his threshold. "Will it be snow when it melts?" "I don't know what it will be." "And what would you do with a name, Boy Snow?" "Use it to open a door. To the Red Keep." The thin man's lashes did not move. "That door opens and closes around men who are not you every day. They come with titles and banners, with vows and knives in their sleeves. They come with gold wrapped in clean linen. They come with their hats in their hands. Which will you bring?" Jon looked at the packet. He was suddenly cold all the way through in a way the wall had not taught him, as if he stood naked on the ice and the wind had skinning knives of glass. "I will bring a promise someone else broke," he said, and found the words were here waiting in his mouth when he went to say them. "I will bring a girl home." The thin man glanced at Thuras, who spread his hands in a gesture that was either helplessness or gratitude. "I like the language of home," the man said, almost to himself. "It has edges most men forget." He opened the packet with delicate fingers and did not blink at the petals. He read the letter once. He read it again. He looked at the record scrap for a long time in a way that told Jon the man could read a lot without moving his eyes much. "It would have been better if you had died quietly at the wall," the thin man said mildly. "It would have been better for the realm if a number of men had died quietly at their appointed posts and not moved. The realm rarely gets what is better for it." He folded the oilcloth and slid it back across the table without keeping any of it. "You will go into the city the night the bells ring for the king's justice in the Flea-Bottom Square. Half the watch will be out crunching peasants. The rest will be half drunk with what they were allowed to take off the bodies. You will go in through a door that even mice forget. You will go into a room that knows how to eat secrets, and a girl with hair that remembers summer will come with you when you leave." "How?" Jon asked. It sounded like a prayer and an insult in his own ears. "You will listen," the man said, "and do not speak unless spoken to. You will stand very still when I tell you to stand very still. And you will remember that when a web is well spun, it can carry a weight much heavier than a fly." The night the bells rang, they rang with a sort of joy that made Jon's stomach tight. Men cheer when they are given permission to hurt and tell themselves it is holy. Jon went through a door so narrow, he had to turn his shoulders sideways and felt stones brush his breastbone. He followed a whisper of oil smoke and damp and the sound of a mouse somewhere worrying a nut under the floor of the world. He followed the thin man who might be a jailer or a fishmonger or a spider. Ghost came behind as if the tunnels were merely a new kind of wood. The walls of the Red Keep felt the way a knife looks left in the snow, clean, hard, likely to disappear if you took your eyes off them. Jon had been in rich halls at Winterfell. Stone remembers certain things no matter where it was quarried. But King's Landing had been once a camp more permanent than its commander thought, and its stones remembered that too. Wine stains do not soak all the way into some stone, and blood only half soaks in, and the rest becomes a gloss that sees its own face. A room opened like a mouth. It had a door built into itself the way a spider hides a trapdoor under moss. The thin man lifted it, and the very air paused as if unused to being let into a place like that. The chamber below smelled of cold iron and stale tears. The sound of the city was a dull, block thing here, like a song in the next room you can hear only when the singer breathes. Sansa sat on a stool with her hands folded on her knees like a pupil at her first embroidery lesson. There was a brightness to her that was not light. It was the way the air feels an hour before snow. She was thinner than in Winterfell, and her eyes had learned not to go too wide when looking at a man. When she saw Jon, she did not move. That restraint took a year off her face. Then she stood, came forward, put her hand to his cheek as if to be certain he was not one of the city's tricks, and said his name in a voice that had left the north and found its own road back. He told her nothing in the way of explanations a well-bred girl might expect, and she asked nothing. She put on a hood that smelled of mouse and lamp oil because a spider had given it to her and because politeness had to be redefined and made to serve other things. They left the way they came, with the thin man humming once under his breath a song that might have been common in Pentos 30 years ago and might have been only a tune men used to balance bundles. They came up in a cellar that had been a wine sink and now kept rotten squash. A man in the livery of the city watch with a thumb-shaped scar through the meat of his cheek opened a door to the alley and turned his back while they used it. Ghost vanished and was a lamp smoke. The alley had a broken shutter that flapped like a stupid bird trying to explain itself to the wind. They moved through a city that had been awoken like a beast and given a cry to make. Jon's heart beat in a steady carpenter's rhythm. He had thought, for a foolish moment, that he could bring Sansa away and then go north again and put his cloak back on and call this detour a thing between breaths. But in the square on Ropemaker's Way, a boy was nailed to a post with rushes woven into his hair for a crown. His hair was black, his eyes blue. A woman was crying as if her chest had broken. Another woman laughed, because those are the two choices some nights. Sansa jerked as if struck and pressed herself closer to the wall until brick dust smeared the palm she laid there. "He makes them take them down before the morning," she said in a voice she must have practiced until it sounded as if she had never used it, "so the smell won't spoil his breakfast." Jon put his hand on hers on the brick and felt the tremor there that a girl's ring might have had. The thin man's shadow moved in a patient way that meant he had planned for 3 contingencies and was mildly annoyed to be encountering a 4th. Ghost picked a path that kept him in grates and doorways, leaving nothing but a sense that light had dimmed briefly when he passed. They reached the river in a ribbon of alleys and slopes of fish scales stacked tight where a man had salted all summer. A skiff waited with a man crouched in her stern with the grace of someone who had been born on a rope between water and deck. He did not speak Tyroshi, though Jon had expected his vowels to lilt. He did not speak at all. He flicked his hand once at the oars. The boat slid into the throat of the Blackwater. They crossed under a bridge where men had pissed and thrown night soil and gold rings in equal measure. The smell wrapped itself around Jon's throat and squeezed. Sansa gagged once without sound. Ghost sat still with the patience of a hunter watching a rabbit go still in its hole when the hawk shadow passes overhead. The far bank was a different city. This one had rot and good work both in it. Nets mended on stoops, bread left on a sill for a neighbor's boy, a door opened and shut, and a child scurried from mud to stone like a crab. In a row house with shutters that a man had planed smooth with care, he had not used on his own face, Davos Seaworth waited and did not pretend otherwise. He had a king's bend to his back he could not get rid of now, and hands with their tops laced by white lines like old riverbeds. When he saw Sansa, something lit in him that had nothing to do with kings at all, and when he saw Jon, he took a breath that had onions in it and old fights. "You," Davos said, as if he had met Jon 100 times in dreams and argued with him there and lost and not minded. "You're the boy the Red Woman keeps swearing she does not see when she looks. That should worry a man." "I'm not the man she's looking for," Jon said. "No," Davos said dryly, "but the world keeps tripping over men it didn't send for and then deciding they are what it meant." He looked at Sansa again and bowed the way a father might to a girl not his own. "My lady, I'll get you out. I'm not promising it will be comfortable, but when the sun comes up you'll still have your hair, and not many can promise that in that city." He jerked his chin at Jon. "As for you, lad, you look like someone's put a coal in your boot, and you can't decide whether to stamp it out or let it burn a hole." Jon took the packet from his sleeve and held it out. "I need to prove a thing before a boy chokes to death on his crown." Davos did not touch it. He took in the oilcloth, the handmade cord. He made a face, half a wince, half a grin. "So that's how the wind blows." He nodded to himself. "We are bound for Dragonstone with half the king's stomach in my boat. It doesn't like the waves. But I know a way to get a letter into a certain room where silk hangs and secrets are folded into the curtains. If you want to shout a name, make sure your voice is where people can hear it. I can get you an audience of the wrong sort if you like. One with ears but no tongue." "I need a room with a throne," Jon said, and did not like how the words came out of him, used to ordering something he had never owned. "That room kills men as easily as any gallows," Davos said. "But you look like a boy who cannot rest until he's stood in it and had it try to make a meal of him. I'll put you on a quay south of the Mud Gate. After that, you'll need all the friends you can buy, and I'm not a rich man. But I have a little credit with a man who always knows where to put a coin to make the right noise." Jon looked to Sansa. Her face was pale, and in her eyes he saw not hope. She was not foolish now, but a poor, stubborn thing that was harsher. "I'll go wherever the boat goes," she said. "And then I'll go where you say." He found the thin man again 2 days later in a room with cheap candles and a floorboard's opinionated creak. The man's hands were folded. He had learned where to place fingers so that even stillness could be read as eloquent modesty. "The king will sit with his mother and his small council 3 afternoons hence," he said without preamble. "His hand will be there, which is to say the only adult in the room will be there. The queen will have her smile on, the kind she keeps very polished. If you insist on bleeding in front of them, at least bleed in a way that makes a pattern. Men are very moved by patterns." "What must I say?" Jon asked and heard the childishness again. "The city made men into boys if they let it point." "Say nothing until they ask," the man said. "And when you say anything, do it without looking to see if anyone likes it. Half of the city's power is in looking unafraid while afraid." He considered. "It will help if you say a northern thing with a northern accent in a voice that suggests you have seen snow. Southerners are very roused by authenticity." The throne room was cold in its heart and hot everywhere else, as if a furnace lived under the floor and a glacier hung from the roof. Joffrey wore a smile that did not know how to stop when it should. He sat at an angle that would make any kind of humility impossible, no matter how much pain his back was in. Cersei wore green as if it were a weapon. Tyrion, the Hand, looked as if he had been sleeping too little and thinking too much, which was in his way and armor. Varys, no longer thin and precise, but himself in full, moved with a largeness that was not fat but an idea of fatness, a softness men hung thoughts on. Littlefinger smiled at the floorboards, admiring their finish, and then smiled at the ceiling as if it were a ceiling he had made. Jon went forward the way a man goes before a weirwood, feeling he trespassed, feeling he was seen no matter where the face looked. He had the packet under his arm. He had Aemon's words under his skin, a prickling like a rash that would not be frightened away. "Who is this?" Joffrey demanded, delighted, because men who can hurt things without consequence are always delighted when something new is put in their reach. "A crow? Have we not had enough of those, uncle?" Tyrion's eyebrows lifted in a way that meant half a dozen things, and none of them kind to Joffrey. "We have not had one in this room before," he said cheerfully. "We must not deprive his grace of any novelty." "I come to claim my right," Jon said without adornment. He did not kneel. He had thought about kneeling and decided it had nothing to do with where his bones were and everything to do with words he might choose or not, and he chose not. "I am Jon of House Stark." He faced Cersei when he said Stark and watched some small animal in her eyes tighten its paws. "I am also." He raised the packet. Varys watched, his hands together. "The son of Lyanna Stark and Rhaegar Targaryen, born of a lawful marriage before gods and men. I claim by blood and by right." The room did not so much gasp as decide, together, not to breathe for a time. It took the sound out of the air and left a mirror stillness. Jon felt the way a boy feels when a lake's ice groans under his weight, the pause before he learns which direction the crack runs. Cersei laughed. It was small and precise and had been sharpened on a whetstone she kept in the locked drawer of a dressing table. "You are a madman or a fool," she said, "or else the North's latest jape. Fantastic. We needed one at court." "Proof would sweeten the tale," Tyrion said lazily, and it was not laziness at all but a net cast. "We've all had a trying month. My nephew is in want of a miracle." Varys took the packet when Jon offered it. He did so with such delicacy that no one could have said he did anything but perform his role as the city's postman. He removed the petals as if they were a small summer, smiled briefly at them as at old friends, and then read without moving too far inside his body. He changed not at all. That was how Jon knew something moved under the man's skin that was not ordinary. Tyrion took the scrap that named Maynard. He was quiet a long time. Littlefinger leaned in to look, and his smile narrowed until it was almost not visible. Cersei did not look at the paper at all, as if the trick would vanish if she stared only at her son. "Rhaegar," Joffrey tried the name on his tongue, as if tasting a bit of fruit from a Dornish market. "He was a traitor and a kidnapper, and dead. Dead men do not get to make new bastards. Off with his head." He laughed at his own joke and petted the arm of the throne as if it were a cat that liked him. "Bastardy is not the claim here," Tyrion said in a tone of real interest that he took care to make sound idle. "The claim is that the prince married the Stark girl, which would have been inconvenient for a number of people, to be sure, and we do love to assume that what is inconvenient cannot have happened. It is a forgery." Cersei put a word instead of a sword into the space. "This is a dirty boy from the gutter with some ink smudged on a paper, and a story the North tells itself when it cannot bear the truth that a little girl wanted to be stolen for the romance of it. Have him whipped and be done." "The seals look real enough," Littlefinger murmured. "Of course, real seals can be misplaced, and a man with a mind for accounts." He tilted his head minutely toward Varys. "Might know where they wash ashore." Varys smiled, light and uncommitted. "My lords, I am a eunuch. I have a very poor memory for anything that is at all diverting." "Even if that ink is true," Cersei said, "it changes nothing. There is a king. He is sitting before you." "Is there?" Tyrion's tone was too mild. It made the room feel as if it could slide. "It has lately been argued in various flavors that the king sitting before us is no king of ours at all." Cersei turned to him like a cat that had remembered it had claws. "Are you trying to be killed, brother?" "I pass the time," Tyrion said. "By not being killed." He considered Jon again. "This would be a curious time for a new dragon to hatch, when we have so many wolves and stags and krakens about the place. And yet," he added, almost to himself, "I find I've always been partial to oddities." Joffrey had grown bored. He pointed at Jon as if ordering a pie. "Kill him." The hound moved 2 steps and stopped because he was a man who did not move unless the movement made sense. "You want him dead, your grace?" he said, voice scarred by the fire that had loved him as a boy. "Here, where the hall can watch him bleed. You'll have half the city telling themselves they saw a dragon's fire come out of him when he died." There was a curl at his mouth as if the idea amused him despite his best efforts. "They'll tell themselves they smelled roses." Joffrey flushed and looked briefly like the boy he was. "Take him," he said instead, sulky. "Throw him in the black cells. He can share with the rats and the spiders. We'll pull him up when we need a new head." Varys said pleasantly, all honey. "Your grace is too merciful. Hard men would suggest carrying him into the square and proving his blood is red like other men's." "Shut up," Joffrey snapped, because he suspected he had been insulted. "Guards." They came, but slowly. The room had changed its air, and men can smell such things. Tyrion raised a hand and made a face of pained competence. "Let us not make a mess if we can help it," he said. "My sister has the laundresses in a state, and they're already chattering about some new cruelty they have to scour out of stone. It is very tedious." He looked at Jon. "You wanted to open a door," he said almost kindly. "You have done so. You found the right room. You will find that rooms do not automatically make good things happen merely because you have put your feet in them." Jon did not resist when they laid hands on him. He could have. A man can do surprising things when he is certain he is about to be broken, and Ghost was somewhere under the hall, awake and aware. But he had made a choice about what to be afraid of, and he had chosen not to be afraid of the sight of hands on his arms. He let the guards take him a little. He let the city watch what it had paid to see. Then the quiet broke like a dish on a tile floor. A girl's voice said, clear and without tremor, "He is my kin." And Sansa Stark stepped out from a side door where servants carried candle stubs and gossip. She had no right to be there. Cersei's face proved it. She held nothing but her own spine in her hands. Yet she came forward with a grace that made the room swallow and parted the guards with the authority of the falls in spring. "He is my blood," she said. "If you kill him, you kill me." She did not look at Joffrey when she said it. She did not give him that measure. Cersei moved in a green flicker and her hand flashed with metal. The hound's hand came down on her wrist before the blade could find a way into the coming night. "My lady," he said to Sansa without irony, and there was something in that title he had not used since he was a boy, the thing ruined for him by fire. "Time to go." He shoved one guard aside with the simple application of his chest. Jon pushed with the other shoulder. The hall seethed in the way a hive seethes when you pour smoke into it. Tyrion, with an expression of despairing amusement, put his shoulder in a different place and made an opening, and through the hole the hound put Sansa, and through the hole Jon went, and Ghost came red-eyed and quiet and put very white teeth into the one guard who had made the mistake of catching his eye. They ran. The Red Keep tried to change their minds by changing its corridors. The hound did not get lost. He moved with a predator's unerring sense of where the weakest latticework was. A door opened where no door had ever been, and a fat man smiled at them in a way that had no triumph in it, only satisfaction, as if a cunning piece of carpentry he had fussed over now fit its join. They crossed the river again with men shouting and bells trying to decide whether they had been asked to be riot or wedding. They were pursued, of course they were, and they shed men the way a horse sheds burrs at a gallop. Davos did not ask questions when they came in a boil of breath and steel. He pushed the boat away with one shove of a long-handled pole that had once moved salt sacks and now moved fugitives, and whispered through his teeth something that sounded like a sailor's prayer to a god with all his fingers. The Blackwater had a humor. It liked men who fled up to a certain point, and then it liked to become a mirror and show them the faces of the men pursuing. The skiff angled into the mouth of a creek where brackish water sucked at reeds like a toothless man on broth. They stowed the boat in a place where no one would be fool enough to look except the man who owned the place. Davos put them into a cart like sacks of barley, and Sansa lay still with her hood up, and Ghost lay on Jon's legs and put the weight of the old gods in him. They came to a farm with a roof thatched in the old style and a yard where chickens stood around as if waiting for judgment. A woman with a face like weather held out her hands to Sansa without looking at Davos first, and then touched the girl's head like some small rite. Jon sat with his back against the cart and closed his eyes and did not sleep. By the time they got as far as the Mander and then cut north again to avoid the Red Lion's stomach, the city had begun to ache for them, and the ache had turned into a pain that woke the court at odd hours. Cersei had a man dragged from his bed in the night and flayed him alive because he had said the word dragon while drunk. Joffrey pouted in a way that made men want to kill him for relief. Tyrion drank a little more than he had meant to and a little less than he could have and thought of patterns. Varys did some sewing. Jon and Sansa came to the Brotherhood again and then left them and came to a river too high to cross and then crossed it because men had cut saplings and lashed them together with an odd competence. They came into the torn country the Lannister foragers had left and into the discipline of men who called Robb Stark king and meant it. They were taken into a camp where a dozen banners flapped, a score more sagged and damp, and the smell of horse and bread warred for mastery. They were taken before a young man with a scar that meant he had laughed at death and then realized death laughed only sometimes and rarely at good jokes. Robb did not speak at first. It took him a short time to breathe again once his eyes had convinced the rest of him this was not one more thing that would smudge if he reached out. When he did speak, the king was in him and the boy too, and neither would go away for the other. "You broke your vows," he said to Jon, eyes steady but not unkind. "You ran from the wall." "I did," Jon said. "You did it for my sister," Robb said softer. "I did." Jon held out the packet. "And for this, read it later," he added because it mattered in his own head. "And for Arya." Catelyn came into the tent after the first words had nodded and loosened, the flaps making a small thunder. She stopped 2 steps short of them and put her hand to her mouth and made a sound men do not often hear themselves making. Sansa stood as if they had been in a court and curtsied, then stood straight again. Catelyn went to her and held her face and did all the things a woman does to prove to her fingers what loving eyes have already told them. When she turned to Jon, the tent changed shape. She had never struck him in his life, and she did not do it now. She allowed herself 1 heartbeat's worth of something bitter, and then the bitter went away. She put her hands on his head as if to bless him, and then said his name as if she had cut herself on it. "Mother," Robb said, quiet. "Listen." He gave her the letter and stood aside because kings can do that too. She read and did not speak. She read again and something moved through her like weather. She sat down on a chest and looked at Jon and then at the tent wall, where the stitches made little ladders men could climb in their minds to escape what was before them. "I said ugly things," she said at length, and it was not an apology, not yet, but it was a door opening onto a road. "You told the truth as you thought it," Jon said, "because a liar has to be taught to lie. So did my father. They argued as men do when they mean to protect one another and cannot agree on how." Ricard Karstark rumbled that they had no use for dragons. The great Jon roared that if the boy could pull a sword from a stone, he did not care whose son he was. Roose Bolton did not bruise the air with his voice at all, which was an argument of its own. In the end, it was not lords who decided the next piece of the world. It was the news that came in. Stannis had lit the sea on fire and had been broken in front of King's Landing by a gold tide. Tywin had ridden in with roses at his heels, and the city had made a noise like a sow satisfied with what it had eaten. If there was to be any justice for Winterfell, for the Whispering Wood, for the heads that had been spoken to and kissed and then nailed in iron cages at the crossroads, it would not come from a stag. "Dorne," Catelyn said, unexpectedly. "Dorne loved Rhaegar. They have reason to hate the Lannisters. If a trueborn son of Rhaegar lives, Doran Martell would weigh that very carefully with his water and fruit." "They will want proof," Robb said. "They will want a plan," Catelyn said. "Men like Doran do not lift their feet without knowing where they will put them down. And the Watch will want my head," Jon said simply. "They have a right to it." Catelyn looked at him a long while. In that look was 30 things. A boy at a high table and a woman young and frightened of what he meant to her. A bed in a tower in a place of summer and a rose crumbling in a northerner's hand. "When men say the word king," she said, "they mean different things. For some it is a chair. For some it is a cup that elbows drink from. For some it is the law that says a thing can be done and the law that says a thing must not. If you take this into your hands, do not do it for the chair, Jon. Do it for the law. Do it for the girls. They sent ravens to Sunspear and to White Harbor and to men who had not yet put on any one lord's colors. They sent a man who had once served at court and could still speak in that roundabout way of the capital where words are cushions for knives. While they waited, Melisandre came in on a red horse that did not seem to notice how cold the air was. She looked at Jon with eyes that had polished deserts in them. She smelled of a wood burning that no one else could find. "There is a king's blood in you," she said in a voice that made men want to sleep and made their spines sweat. "It licks at your skin like dawn." "I'm not your king," Jon said. "And if I were, I wouldn't be yours." She smiled, slow. "The snow speaks," she murmured. "If you are not mine, you will be someone's, because men like to belong. Give me a cup of your blood, and I will give you a wind that will blow your enemies into the sea." Davos, behind her, made a face as if the fire stank worse than onions when it burned. "Leave off," he said bluntly. "The boy's not a candle you can snuff and relight with a sweet." "I have relit worse," she said, and the soft way she said it was a blade. Then she turned to go, only smiling a little. "You will come to me when the night closes," she said over her shoulder. "They always do." Doran Martell's answer took its time and looked like nothing when it came. Only a parchment with a seal as brittle as old honey. But the words in it had been placed with care and said yes, in a manner of speaking, if the manner could be made to include a marriage treaty and a number of conditions that to Jon read like a man's careful rearrangement of furniture, so he would not bruise his shin on anything when finally he did decide to walk through the house. He wanted a prince in his water gardens and a princess wreathed in winter roses and a promise of safety for a line that had already been broken once by a mountain and a boy too young to put his hands up in time. He wanted the law to hold. Jon learned to speak to Dornishmen in letters. He learned to speak to men like Davos with bread and fish by the fire without ceremony. He learned to speak to Sansa in quiet hours when the camp slept and she looked at the stripped-down sky that had forgotten the light of candles and told him what the songs sounded like when you took the music away and left only the words. He learned to speak to Robb with a shared look over a map when lords were shouting and both brothers needed a language that had no arrows in it. He did not call himself Aegon out loud, though men around him tried it on their tongues as if it were a plum. He called himself Jon, and men who wanted to believe a thing would believe it anyway, and men who did not, did not. He did not put on a crown. He ordered a banner made because men can see a story when it is stitched in cloth, and many cannot when it is written on paper. On a field of black, the three-headed dragon unfurled in red, and beside it ran the gray of the dire wolf on white. Over both a winter rose of pale blue had been worked small in the corner, for those who cared to look. "It's too much," he muttered when the woman held it up for his inspection. "It's a tavern sign." "It's a tale," she said. "People like tales. They like to tell themselves that they are inside one." The first men to ride under it were not lords. They were hedge knights with good hands, small folk with bigger faith. 3 boys who had written wolf in the dirt outside their cottage with a stick and decided it would do for a life. Then came 2 river lords who had lost sons to Gregor Clegane and decided the Lannister pence they were handed with their dead did not glitter enough. The Brotherhood without banners brought him a court of firelight and songs and men who had no patience for kings and nevertheless found themselves using the word with less scorn when they looked at the boy who listened and did not pretend he could feed winter by a decree. Aemon sent a letter that came by a path only birds knew. It was small, said, "Then what? The world asks it of us always. If you knit a thing, do it with both hands. If you pull a thing apart, understand how its threads are crossed. And remember that the night is not only cold because it has stars." The old man's hand had written a line to himself at the bottom and forgotten to blot it. A Targaryen alone in the world is a terrible thing. And then a stroke through alone and the substitution of another word, written crookedly, badly, divided. They did not march on King's Landing. Tywin had made that road into a mouth lined with teeth, and men who had used that mouth lately had not come out in the shape they went in. They marched where they were needed and made the Lannisters' food lines bleed. They moved small back and forth movements that made much larger men in court grow angry because they could not see where to swing a sword. At salt pans they found women who had forgotten what gentleness was and fetched it back for them with the patience of men making shoes. At Fair Market they threw a noose over a Lannister banner and dragged it in the dirt and laughed like men surprised themselves by finding a joy left in the world. They wrote letter after letter, and the letters worked on the world with a slow, patient skill no sword can have. When the winter finally laid its palm heavy over the riverlands, they turned north, because all words about kings were only summer talk if the wall was not held. The wildlings had come like a storm, and Mormont had done the only thing he could, and the wind had still gone the way it wanted. Jon knew the feel of the cold that comes with a purpose of its own. He had known it standing on the walkway high over the world, while the bell rang and men below stirred in their dreams and called their mothers. He knew it now, deeper and patient, the kind of cold that has nowhere to be but here, nowhere to do but this. Robb stood over the map and met his brother's eyes. "If you go back to die," he said. "Perhaps. You owe them your head." "Ido." Robb's mouth tightened. "You owe me your sword." "I'll leave it with you," Jon said. He put Ghost's head in his hands briefly and felt the wolf's breath damp on his wrists. "I have another thing to use. And if the watch hangs you, then they do as they must. I did as I must." Jon's voice was quiet as falling ash. He could feel Aemon in it. He could feel Ned Stark too, which comforted him and scalded him at once. "We are not one thing, Robb. Neither is the world," Robb said tiredly. "Go then. Be two things. Be 10. But come back if you can." Sansa stood with wool over her hair and a pin with a small blue rose in it he had found somewhere and not asked where. She kissed him on the cheek as if she were his true sister and looked at him with eyes that had learned too much. "Do not be noble when you need to be cunning," she said. "Father was too noble. I loved him for it. It killed him just the same." He rode with a few and then with fewer. The road north was the same scar and a new one besides. In the woods he found a boy hunting rabbits with a sling, and when Jon gave him bread the boy flinched as if struck. In a town with 3 houses and 1 smithy where the smith had left his hammer on the anvil and gone to the war and not returned, an old woman told him what she had dreamed. A blue rose blooming in a field of ash, and he did not laugh at it. He rode on. The cold put its hand in his mouth and held his tongue carefully as if to measure it for something later. At the wall he did not hide. He gave his name to the gate and they gave him back a silence like a blow. Men he had eaten with and held in the yard with practiced swords and cursed in the mess looked at him as if the shape of him had changed in some essential way and the light went around him differently. Jeor Mormont was dead by then, lost to a mutiny that had been half hunger and half hate and all winter. Bowen Marsh wept as if the wind had cut him and then called for a rope. The rope did what ropes do. They put it on Jon's neck and he did not ask them not to. Maester Aemon came out with Sam, limping. The old man carried the winter in his bones and in his face and in the weight of his words and did not take any more winter with him while he walked. He simply moved through being cold as if cold were a thing as ordinary as bread. "Stop," Aemon said, and men who had set themselves to hang a traitor found they did not know how to disobey a very old man who had learned how to be a wall. "If you kill him now," Aemon said, and there was no magic in it, only arithmetic and memory. "You put out 1 fire to warm yourselves for an hour when the night has 10,000 hours in it." He broke his vows, Bowen Marsh hissed, and his cheeks shone with the wet of a grief that did not know where to sit. "He did," Aemon said, "and kept another." He put his hand to Jon's cheek as if he were a child and as if they were in a room somewhere and a fire was burning and a door did not fit in its jamb. "What does a man owe Lord Steward?" "Everything," Bowen whispered, "because that is the answer in the catechism boys learn when they put on black." "And how many times?" Aemon asked. Bowen did not have an answer to that. They cut the rope and the welt on Jon's neck burned like a new law written into him. It was not absolution. It was a stay of a sentence passed by a winter that had considerations beyond men's calendars. He took no command. He took a place where a man with a sword and a wolf could do work. He taught boys to hold a spear so they would not feed themselves to bones that remembered hands. He slept in a room with a window the wind liked to visit. He wrote letters because men far away needed to be told to send wheat. to send men who could be hungry without turning on their order, to send the good leather and not the stuff that went brittle when the cold entered it. In the night, he stood on the walkway and watched the northern lights make ghosts of themselves on the sky. He thought of kings and crowns and the hearts that had opened to him because he had brought them something better than a crown, a new word to say home with. He thought of Sansa in a tent reading a map with a look in her eye that had learned the grammar of the world again and was not going to forget it. He thought of Arya, somewhere under a hedge or in a castle's shadow, moving with a quick grace that no man would ever learn to read in time. He thought of Ned Stark, who might have loved him as a son if the world had been kinder, and who had learned to love him as a burden and a joy both. He thought of Lyanna Stark, who had died in a room with southern light that now lived only in the pressed petals of a rose, and in a letter a man of the marsh had written in a careful hand because he had been asked to remember. The night came, and men learned who they were because night always teaches it. Jon went into the woods with Ghost at his side and felt the trees looking and did not decide whether they liked him or did not. He fought things that no man will ever put in a song because songs ask for explanations and there are none for some of the old things. He came back with blood on his clothes and he gave what he had taken to the snow and said a small prayer. He wrote a letter to Robb and did not send it. He wrote a letter to Sansa and did. When spring came, if spring could still be called that, it came like a thin thought you could almost not hold. In the riverlands an orchard put out 2 blossoms and a girl laughed because the tree had remembered something. In King's Landing, Tyrion resigned from something he had never been properly appointed to and sat in a chair and considered what it would cost to be the sort of man who can stop a thing when it must be stopped, and whether he was that man. Cersei drank wine and stared at the walls. Joffrey pretended to be a king and then pretended at something else, and in the pretending hurt himself because boys break themselves sometimes on their own games. Varys folded a bit of paper into a bird and put it on a sill. It flew. It knew where to go. Jon rode the wall with a small escort and found a place where the stones sang a different note. He stood there and said, "I am Jon." And the wind took the name away and did not bring it back, because the world had done what it does to names and made them heavier. He did not say Aegon. He did not need to. The world had its own way of putting crowns on heads, and sometimes it was only a wreath of winter grass a boy braided while he waited for his father to come over a hill, and sometimes it was a shadow of flame made while a priest blinked at it and pretended not to be afraid. Sometimes it was a rope scar on a neck. He put his hand on Ghost's head, and Ghost leaned, and the weight of that love did not make him stumble. In the distance, far down the long white that never ends, he thought he saw a single thing moving that did not fit. It was a man, perhaps. It was a memory of a man. He looked again and it was gone, or it was only a drift settling back into itself after the wind set it thinking of walking. They would say of that winter that kings rose and fell like sparks on a wind, and they would argue in their feather beds later about which had been true and which had been the dreams men had needed. They would make careful accounts in Old Town and propose laws for it. They would write songs that put the right harp line under the right words. A boy with red hands would learn to bend wood into the right shape, for a bow and pride would sit easy in him because his hands did not shake anymore when he drew. A little girl would sleep with a knife under her straw and know she would wake before a man's hand could find her mouth. A woman with a blue rose pressed in a book would touch the petals and taste the faintest dust of summer and not cry, because she had done too much to make the world better for crying now. Jon watched the north. He did not forgive himself. He did not require the world to forgive him. He took the blame into himself where it sat beside a more stubborn thing than guilt. When he slept, he dreamed of a room with southern light and a voice saying, "Promise me," and he did not know whether it was command or plea he heard. He woke and went to the yard and put a sword in a boy's hand and said, "Lift your elbow. Not so high. There, like that, good." And the boy looked at him with a gratitude that embarrassed both of them. Some nights he took the petals out and touched them carefully with a finger that had learned to hold steel. They crumbled a little more each time. He would have liked to see the roses alive, their color thick as a sky before storm. He had seen other beautiful things break and had learned to love them anyway. He put the petals away and went to the walkway and listened to the low music in the stone, the note the wall had learned under the long weight of wind. He stood his watch. He kept his vows the way a man keeps any vow when the choices are not between right and wrong but between wrong and less wrong and the hope that wrong can be put to use. When letters came, as letters always do, they bore the marks of a world still are. Unning. Dorne's oranges had survived. A prince had not married a rose but had learned to be patient enough to knife with words and make his enemies walk where he could reach them. In the Vale, a little lord blew bubbles and learned to say his mother's name without sobbing, and a woman who had used knives more careful than steel looked west as if the sun had left something on the horizon for her to fetch. In the Riverlands, Sansa stood in a hall with a roof that did not leak and ordered a table set for men who came to speak with her about granaries and justice. And when they left, she walked into a godswood with a weirwood that had learned to live in the southern earth and stood with her palm against its face, learning to speak that language at last. A parchment, one among many, bore a dotted seal. A child had put a pin in it in error and laughed when the wax stuck to his finger. Inside, a short list of needs. Nails, salt, 2 good masons, the best wool you can find, because the winter has tried its teeth on us. At the bottom, a line in a hand Jon recognized for the calm discipline of it. Come home if you can. If you cannot, know that when we say your name here, we mean it as we say our own. The signature was simply Sansa. He put it beside Aemon's words, beside Howland's letter, beside the record of a careful man who had loved columns more than human trouble. He stood a watch that night in a snow like sifted flour, and when the dawn came the world had changed not at all and entirely both. He looked north and south and knew they were the same line looked at from different sides. He drew breath and it did not break. He let it out and it did not show much in the cold. When men came to him and said Lord or your grace or brother, he answered to whichever they chose. He did not split himself in two when he did it. He found he had learned to be the rope that tied the names. He told boys and old men how to set their feet, and sometimes he told them to rest. When he rode out and found a band of things that remembered knives and snow for teeth, he put his sword into the work and did not think of crowns or chairs or papers with precise recorded names. He thought of a girl's voice saying he is my kin, and of the sound the city had made when it had watched a story unfold and not been able to decide which ending it wanted yet. He thought of winter's long hours and the short ones that had human voices in them. He carried his name like a thing written in 2 inks now, one that bled a little when the paper got wet and one that did not. He cared for both. When, in time, men would quarrel under a summer tent about how exactly he had claimed and under whose reign, about whether it had been legal or right or necessary, about whether the gods had nodded or looked away, Jon would be somewhere walking along a high place, looking down at a line men had built to make winter keep its distance a little. He would be counting the barrels. He would be looking at the sky to read the weather. He would be thinking of a woman who had died a long time before with a blue thing near her hand and a man who had made a promise because love can be a weapon if you make it be. He would be standing his watch. He would, sometimes, allow himself to imagine the room of southern light made solid. No longer a dream but a place, roof and lintel, walls hung with woven cloth to keep off the sun. He would imagine a harp. He would imagine a hand, his own, with a baby's head in it the size of an apple, his thumb cupping a softness that trusted itself to be held. He would imagine all that he had not had. Then he would let it go and take up what he had instead. The bite of the wind, the rough braid of ghosts rough under his hand, the taste of bread still warm in a kitchen where boys had been laughing and trying not to burn themselves, the sound of a young man saying lift your elbow, not so high, there, like that, good, as if he were repeating a lesson he had received and now, at last, could give. On the day the first true spring bird crossed the wall, a small thing with an ordinary song, not the omen men would have preferred, Jon did not smile. He nodded, as men nod to each other when they pass on a road and recognize a face and keep their feet moving. He said the old words under his breath and felt them sit in his bones. The wind had not softened, not yet. It would, or it would not. He stood. He did not move left or right to make the world give him room. He made the room by belonging to it. Below, somewhere beyond his reach, kings and queens rearranged their chairs and their cups. They bent in the middle to allow new names to sit with them. They wrote letters. They swore in front of gods and men. They promised me. They promised you. They promised the realm. They promised themselves they would keep all these, and sometimes they did. They promised and broke and promised again. Jon watched the horizon and felt the long night like a tide at his back that had gone out and would come again. He wanted for a blink to be the boy who had dreamed of honor without complication and winter without human teeth. He was not that boy. He did not grieve him, not anymore. He breathed and the breath smoked and the wind took it and made it something else. Ghost turned his head, nose high, reading the air, and Jon laid a hand upon him as if to say, as if to promise, as if to vow, we are here.